We're seeing massive climate and biodiversity emergency. There are 1 million threatened species in the world. The planning and design of our cities is critical to actually maintaining nature and rebuilding our critical urban ecologies.
The challenge globally in other nations like Canada and New Zealand and other parts of North America is acknowledging the impact of the colonial experience on First Nations people. Whose heritage are we protecting? How we create and calibrate public spaces is really important. I tend to favour those places which aren't commodified, so you actually have to pay to sit down because you're at a cafe. Those places where it's got nothing to do with commerce, it's got to do with how we create an environment and a city which is accommodating all the needs of people.
One of the consequences of this very high density development is that no provision was made for open space. So we're having to retrofit that. Like this flyover here. This area was used to store taxis for Crown Casino. Now we're actually going to turn it into an active recreation area. So like the basketball court, which is temporary, that will in fact be the sort of uses you'll have here. And I think those are the opportunities in the cities. How do you retrofit them? Using spaces that people wouldn't imagine could be open space and make them attractive to people in the city.
There is a real challenge for built environment practitioners and architects in particular in adaptive reuse. So what really needs to start to be considered is the life cycle cost of a building, to not just erase everything and start again when we want to build, but also keeping some of the characters of the city. Importantly, what we also need to do is accommodate the fabric that stitches a society together. So public space becomes really important. New public parks become important. They become the lungs of the city.
I think there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that connections with nature improve people's health and well-being. What we're really increasingly doing is understanding the value of landscape to connect us to our environment, and how by connecting us to nature we can actually better connect to each other. Being in nature reduces anxiety and helps to create a sense of social connection, which is also linked to maybe up to 15 years difference in life expectancy. In terms of planning in Melbourne, we are continuing to threaten the urban growth boundary. We're starting to encroach increasingly into threatened species, in particular grasslands, which are really critical ecosystems. Planning legislation changes that stop sprawl and start to create more compact cities are really, really critical. We need to start creating continuous connections to public open spaces, making sure they're of a good size, that they combine active and passive recreation, good understory and biodiversity. We can also start to green facades and green walls and introduce green roofs and podium landscapes. So that means really layering up public realm above the city's skyline. Market Street really came about through quite a long process. 2/3 of a road with parking became a publicly accessible park and really started to increase the amount of public open space in the western side of the city. We've achieved Green Star ratings in terms of ecological biodiversity. We're seeing introduced habitat for birds and bees and insects. Many of those plants are planting that was there hundreds of years ago that we're starting to try and introduce back into the city. It's also got well ratings in terms of the use of vertical water walls, which obviously birds and insects can benefit from, and also humans can benefit from in terms of having evaporative cooling effect. We're using direct and indirect experiences of nature to make you feel present, which is known to really have, again, good psychological benefits. The site is the site of the old Western Market, so it has a very particular history and place in Melbourne. It is a sloped site, it's quite hilly, and it connects down to the Yarra River, or Birrarung. Birrarung is important to Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Australia, so we really wanted to celebrate a pre-colonial understanding of the landscape. using water as a playful element, but also to reveal again histories of what the Yarra used to be like.
All the sites in which we've built on have a story to be told. One element which I think is really important to consider is how do we embed Indigenous perspectives into design practice. And so we're moving from this sort of notion of the muralisation of culture or the museumisation of culture to actually embedding it as part of the DNA of the design thinking. What it really does is it starts to celebrate culture, it celebrates diversity and it celebrates inclusivity. Effectively, utilising heritage spaces is often a design challenge. How do we actually give voice to the existing intact part of the heritage that we may seek to keep, but how do we also acknowledge the changeability of a building over time? My sort of critique of heritage policies and guidelines is what it doesn't often acknowledge is landscape heritage, cultural heritage, intangible heritage. We tend to become fixated on built form heritage to the exclusion of all other forms of heritage. The new Student Precinct project is a transformative project for the University of Melbourne. It involves 5 existing buildings being transformed, a number of which are heritage controlled, and 2 new buildings added, which incorporates an Indigenous design narrative which was co-designed with First Nations people. And so really it's about the spaces which students gather. The arts and culture is sort of embedded within this broader precinct. Through the conversation with traditional owner groups, we're able to engage with this idea of a water story that traversed through the campus. The history and the ideas will be interpreted through wayfinding and through other strategies to really tell this story embedded in place. So it becomes part of the normative experience for students and staff and visitors to the campus is to understand that deeper history of country. This project is certainly not only for the university but for the city. People have the access into the university because it will be adjacent to a new metro station and provides a really compelling proposition in terms of storytelling embedded within the city.
Small things like Market Street are the first signs of a much bigger idea. And that's the way the city's changed. A big vision, incrementally achieved.
I guess what we've been talking about is ways that as a landscape architect we can make significant contributions to our cities in terms of greening our cities. But it's not just the responsibility of designers or government or private developers to help with that. If you're fortunate enough to have a garden, you can start to introduce water, rocks, plants that are locally Indigenous. That will help with biodiversity and habitat. And then if you don't have any access to any external space, you can start to look how you might get involved in different land care initiatives. There's always ways to get involved in greening a city.
A city which works well is a city which is inclusive, which has accessibility at its core, that it has good infrastructure, there's good public transport, they're walkable cities, there's recreational spaces, there's green spaces. All those ingredients are really important. It's a concrete jungle out there. So how do we start to peel back some of those layers so we can have a much more responsive city to the needs and the changing dynamics of the environment as well?
Well-designed public and green spaces that better connect our city's residents with First Nations heritage, with each other, and with nature are essential to our well-being. But they also give us a sense of identity, a way of telling our stories to future generations and visitors. I have been amazed by the biodiversity in Australian cities, and it's clear we cannot just design cities for people. We have to consider an approach that allows all urban species to thrive.